Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another session from the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19. Today, we have with us Saroj Mohanta, who's a director at ECOCIATE, and he's going to talk about ethnography studies for the BoP. Now, I'm going to pass to Amr Qais, a dear colleague and friend, and also a famous marketeer, and he's going to moderate the session. So without much further ado, Amr, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Ali. I actually would like to thank the Gerhard Center represented my dear friend and colleague Ali Aouni twice. Once for the effort they make in selecting very informative and reputed speakers, like our speaker for tonight. And actually, the second reason is giving me this opportunity to moderate a session discussing a tool that is very close to my heart and very useful also in reaching many of our developmental goals, as we will see in the presentation. When we talk about ethnographic research, of course, just to lay the foundation very quickly, we're talking here about a qualitative research approach that involves observing variables in their natural environment or habitat in order to arrive at objective research outcomes. As the name suggests, of course, ethnographic research has its roots in ethnography, which is the in-depth study of people, culture, habits, and so on. Ethnography also was not very distant from the development and technological evolution that we are witnessing. So now maybe we are getting familiar with the term ethnography. And ethnography is about researchers who are studying the online communities, similar to the way they study the offline communities in order to understand how people interact and identify social communication and so on. Similar to what Ali did, I don't want to take much of your time so that we can benefit as much as we can from our reputable and sound expert, Mr. Saroj Kumar, who is a marketing professional with expertise in marketing research, consumer insights, innovation. He has been working in emerging markets for 20 years. His specialization in ethnography research and applied it successfully in the rural markets in India and other countries to understand consumer behavior and identify their felt needs and pains. Also, he has contributed to the development of products and process concepts that have driven innovation in companies and social enterprises. He was instrumental in adapting a social research tool for market research, participatory rural consumer appraisal, a tool which helps understanding consumers and the ecosystem, as well as the attitude and behavior and practices. He has innovated a market-based supply chain model for delivering nutritional products to targeting a malnourished tea garden worker community in Upper Assam, an area located in far northeast of India. The model is being scaled to many other areas in the country. Allow me to welcome Mr. Saroj and to give him the floor for the very insightful presentation that we are looking forward to receive. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Case. So, welcome everybody to this session, and and thank you for this opportunity, Gerhard Center. And this has been a great pleasure to be associated with Dr. Ali. There has been other opportunities in the past where I had some opportunities to exchange my notes with Dr. Ali in India during a major conference on BoP innovation here in India. And that led to some exchanges, and I thought this is a great opportunity that I have to exchange or share my thoughts with a larger community there in Egypt and other parts of the world. I will like to state here that the whole idea of ethnography research in marketing, uh, it, it's the whole idea emerges from the thought that when we are dealing with communities where, or when companies are wanting to go into markets which are less explored, or communities who are new to their as target segments in their business, whether it is social business or even in the corporate business. The idea is, how do you find solutions with communities with whom we have little interaction before and we have little understanding about that ecosystem. Uh, but the same thought process goes one level up when we look at ethnography of engaging, uh, when we engage with uh, potential consumers or potential beneficiaries, and we try to look at them from the context of what would, how effectively they can use the services that we are offering, or how effectively can we design a product which they can probably consume, considering their in their ecosystem. uh, because innovation can always be great technologically, but from the point of adoption, acceptance and adoption, the pathway can be different, and sometimes very good products can also fail. So with that, I'll start my session, and just give me a minute to put my presentation up. Okay, so this uh, Dr. Robert Chambers, he was the initial ideator for the participated rural appraisal. And this whole concept was used in the social domain, where largely the community was involved in helping understand the resources they have in their village, or their which they access, and what they are unable to access, and what is something that they will like to have. Because often when we ask these people who are probably not included as much in our current business format, they really do not know what kind of solutions they want. So a participative way helps them to understand their own access and difficulties, and it helps uh, the the service provider or business uh, the business the business to understand their needs from the grassroots, and then convert that into a need. So so what we are talking about here is trying to look into the felt need, the pain points, and then arriving at business solutions. So why is that need for research, the BOP market? Does it require need a different kind of a research? So basically, this BOP consumer that we are talking about is a little less known consumption unit, which means that we do not have much data or understanding about their way of consumption, and what kind of the preferences are there, what are the access points, etc. So without that understanding, it becomes difficult to start. So any kind of research which we want to do with them needs that we start at some point, and if we already have some information, we can build on that. So why is it an unknown unit? Because they have not been on the consumption radar of the companies and others, so therefore the information is scarce. uh, I remember when we did started doing work around 1999 on this, uh, we were using the census data to try to project certain kind of uh, business opportunities in these markets, which companies were reluctant to, look at those markets as potential. But as we brought out information from those sources, we were able to build on that. So every market needs to have some kind of base to start with. Very limited brand information is available about this about what they consume in these communities. Uh, and often when companies look into their brands, they are looking at uh, the brands which are major, or let's say they are multinational brands, or they are the major brands of that country. Many of the local brands, regional brands are never measured, and these are brands are what most of the time found to be consumed by these BoP communities. And often in India, especially, we have a lot of spurious material which is manufactured and made available in these communities, because when companies advertise on mass media, there is often that whole dimension where people become aware, they aspire for it, but when they don't get it, and they also don't sometimes know that what they are consuming is not the original product that they as what they wanted to get. And even from the company's point of view, they have a certain distribution reach. But when it comes to the rural areas of the country, you find that there's a lot of, in the last 20 years in India, we have got some very good initiatives here. But it's still that many companies have not been able to design models where they can reach out to the last mile. So that means the BoP consumer seems to be different. So how is it different? So when we look at the literacy levels at that stage, what we see is usually there is a lesser level of literacy in the overall community. Sometimes the literacy lack of literacy is because of the cultural traits or the kind of community, and there is sometimes found to be genders related to gender, that certain communities women are not sent to school. So there are different kinds of social dimensions which leads to such literacy issues. Uh, while we take media for granted in cities and towns, often the rural does not have access to media. These days we have telecom communication, and a lot of internet is talked about. But even within India, when I say that, when I go into rural areas, there are a lot of areas where you cannot. While we are now talking about moving from 4G to 5G, but many areas we do not even get 2G. So it is a challenge where that there's a large segment of the population which is not able to access the media, and therefore our marketing ideas and other things gets limited. When we look at occupation, again, there's a big difference there when we look at these BoP markets or the rural markets, the villages, even in small towns. As we move away from cities and manufacturing hubs, slowly we find that the population is more working around agriculture and allied activities. So their kind of incomes, the kind of seasonality of incomes makes a lot of difference. So therefore their systems need to be understood. Um, and again, here, when we look at the people there, they have been living with a lot of risk, which because of they live with a lot of traditional occupations, and they are the ones who have to keep upgrading their skills. Sometimes with support of government, sometimes with support of NGOs, sometimes by corporates under the certain of their skill development programs. But what we see is more larger part of the population is still working around what they have learned over through generations, and they are those risk-taking entrepreneurs. So the kind of mindset is in many ways superior when it comes to the entrepreneurial thought process. When we look at the security environment, again here, the ecosystem, most of us would see that there is a different kind of a social security mechanism, and there are sometimes those cultural dimensions which provide the security, And but again, the social strife and social dimensions can have bearing on the kind quality of life or the kind of life people lead. Infrastructural conditions, again, as you all understand, we have issues related to access to energy, access to water, access to some basic things which often has challenges related to health, education, etc. in these markets. So of course, the products and brands access is what we talked about. So where are we going from here in terms of looking at the research methodologies? What we see is when we look at sample designing issues, so typically in a quantitative method, we are using uh, the typical very difficult to find a list of households, and therefore any kind of random processes are being adopted and other things. We have certain challenges. Of course, we have scientific methods to deal with them, but the typical urban centric approach sometimes has to be now revisited and seen how to make it work. Uh, and of course, the villages, as we talk about, or the rural areas, typically they have that whole element of cluster kind of living in communities or in religious communities or some kind of a tribal communities or other forms of communities. So then the process of research has to understand those dimensions and then conduct the research. It cannot be it's not a homogeneous population. In India, especially, we have a lot of joint family system, which is, of course, going into nuclear families in urban areas. Even in rural areas, some kind of nuclearization is happening. But still, in many ways, they have joint uh, joint families, and they live uh, around in kind of a interdependence with each other. Uh, And of course, when we talk about rural, because they have to survive, they look at different options too. So they may be involved in multiple occupations, and therefore, if we are trying to, in typical research methodology, we try to see whether what's the occupation, and probably it is one occupation that we can factor in, but probably there are more than one. So how do you factor them in that kind of a setting? And something's very basic in terms of data collection, but very important is these communities have their own ways of looking at how they assess the preferences, or assess the products and services and make preferences, and may not be using a very mathematical scale or those kind of dimensions. And therefore, when we ask them to use any kind of such scales, it's difficult for them to really come out with responses which are which we want in our processes that we adopt. Uh, so many times we find that they fear people from outside. So the need to be able to communicate with them in a way which they do not see as threatening, or something which is probably not good for them, or something which dives immediately into their lives. They sometimes switch off, and writing them or putting them onto any kind of documentation creates more of the fear. So these are like simple things, but in those communities, engaging and getting responses becomes difficult in such settings. Often we find our culturally, we are not, at least in India and South Asia, we find that we are not accustomed to, our culture doesn't talk about 1 tablespoon, half tablespoon, or ounce of something, or ounce of something. We just have an approximation, a little of this and little of that. Now that is somewhere, when we specifically ask about two people about quality and assessment of qualities, they are unable to really put them into figures So therefore, you again run into problems unless you take that initiative to measure them and see whether that helps build our research case. Brand recognition, well, many times we come across this component where people cannot recognize brand because the kind of alphabets that are used are many times in English, and people are not educated in English. They have their own different language. In India, we have so many languages. We have recognized languages of more than 15 more than 15 recognized languages by the government of India, and of course there are so many dialects. So in that kind of a setting, it becomes furthermore problem where people have cannot associate with a third a language which is not in where they do not have the exposure. And of course, when the connotations, now this is where the cultural dimension comes in, where they will express themselves in a way which we have to understand what they are trying to talk about. Often what we see is when they're talking about or expressing something, they will associate it with their own cultural context, and what they mean and what we understand can have a big difference. Therefore, what comes in as a question is how much can we use the tools that we have developed in the West and we are trying to apply in our culture? Does it give the right responses and those challenges? These have been discussed in the past as well, and continues to be a challenge because we have yet to adapt tools which are for our own settings and cultures. So the need to innovate even in research. So what are the dimensions so when we talk about innovate, the first thing that comes up is what are the different kind of social infrastructures in which people live. So in a setting like India, we have cooperatives. So we have farmer cooperatives, we have weavers cooperatives, we have milk cooperatives. We have so many different types of cooperatives which were promoted under the different government schemes. They have been there for more than 100 years in this country. Of course, I'm not talking about organizations which have been more than 100 years, but the concept has been there for more than 100 years, and they are in different forms. We have these agriculture markets which are created again under the government's initiative. There's an act which has brought in for the trading of farm produce. So this is again a place which is the marketplace, and where people interact. Farmers bring in goods, they sell, they have. So this is an important point for economics in this market in India. We have a lot of microfinance groups now. So there are women groups who have, so in India we have more than 6 million women groups, and they are saving money, they are getting into small businesses. So women who were behind the curtain for a long time are slowly coming out under these microfinance systems, where they are saving money, they are taking decisions, and they are getting into small economic activities, which is adding to their household income. But more importantly, it is giving them that space in the family and the society. So that's an important social change. And then we have what we call the weekly markets in India. And these markets are very important. We have more than 42,000 of these weekly markets that appear once every week across the country. I mean, they come up every week after week. So it is a very big business exchange that happens here. So there's a lot of transactions in town. You can see a lot of products which are food products. There are clothing material, there are kitchen material, other things which are all available in this kind of markets. And people access these markets, even though we have what we call the permanent markets, not exactly in these places. Maybe in the places they exist, these are like they come up weekly and therefore important markets. So the social infrastructure becomes important. And so what else? So we have these the permanent markets, the shops, and but again, these shops are small. There are little access. Their products are not available. Not all brands are available. So small. The access to products and services, as we understand, is limited and is a challenge. And then we have the issues like electricity availability, access to energy, etc. So that also is a challenge in many places. So therefore, a lot of consumer durables are not marketable in these areas. So, and many of these things affect us, and therefore we need alternate to energy, or we need uh, other forms of energy. So what therefore we are driving around is, as we look at the entire this is everything is around community. And here what we see is individuals are less important, their family is important, and more their interaction with the other community is also uh, important. And what we see is, therefore, whenever we look at demand, we see that there is something that initiates that demand, but it is that doesn't conclude there. There are different people, so there are influences will influence that. There will be decision makers. So if the consumer is the girl in the house, probably she will look at her mother to influence her father to help her buy the product, because she cannot directly access or tell her father that I need this. And therefore, as a decision, when we see it, there's no singular point at which the decisions are happening, and therefore your buying process gets elongated. So your time taken is more. So what we are looking at a contextualization of this whole thing, we see that while there is a household which we go to conduct the research, but there's a community around which around those households who influence them directly, and then there are other stakeholders in that ecosystem who have a large, who do have a stake, or let's say do have influence on these households. And therefore it is not something that if we talk about as research and talk about consumer, it is not like in the urban setting where the consumer by himself is taking a decision. But let's say, for example, in a urban setting, buying a mobile phone is not a great deal. But in that setting, probably there are three people or four people or five people who are taking decision to buy one mobile phone. And this we have seen even on products like tractor tires and other things, where even if the farmer has to buy a tractor tire for his own tractor, he is going around talking to people, finding out which would be the best thing, best buy. And therefore, a lot of such influences exist. And that has an implication on how we conduct the research. So what we need to understand is the ecosystem and the community, and therefore adopt the PRCA. And this is the community participation approach, where the community, the belief is that the community understands his ecosystem and his context better than us. So therefore, if we want a solution, we need to get their understanding first before we develop our understanding. And we cannot ask questions just because we want to ask them, but because the questions become important from uh, because the context that the consumers bring forth from their understanding of their needs. So what it brings about is, it brings community response, and it's a voluntary participation. And it, because it's a sheet of paper, so they are drawing it, they're pictorially drawing it, and they are good at that because they most of their communication is visual in nature, which we see from uh, from different cultures and heritages, that pictorially a lot of things are depicted. So what it enables, that ecosystem enables, is a sharing, the enhancement, and their own analysis of their knowledge and their life, and which therefore brings in a bottom-up approach to the thought process for us as researchers. But from their point of view, it is easy for them to express themselves in their own way. Instead of our interruptions and interpretations, they do it their way, and it becomes our job to look at how how to interpret that. So this is a kind of a process that I'm sharing, which from a very this is something that we were doing for a telecom company, but in which we inviting the community to draw up and tell us about their towers and other things. So they participate in the process, and this is something that we started sometime around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and it continued for the discussions happened, and they were, because they were expressing themselves and they were sharing their ideas, the time passed, and so the even and the it became evening. The people put up candles, the electricity was not there, and then after some time, uh, as the electricity comes, they blow away their candles and they are back in the discussion. So what I'm trying to say here is it's very difficult to if we go and try to do just a group discussion with our thoughts, it is difficult for them to engage with us because they do not associate with our what we want to discuss. Whereas when they discuss it themselves, there are so many things they come up with. And this is a market access map that I'm trying to show here from the tea gardens, where we are doing a project on supply chain. And our project was supposed to be like to find a solution for nutrition, or the supply chain for nutrition products are non-existent or less prevalent in these areas. So how do you design something by which nutritional products can flow into the tea gardens? And this tea garden, I do not know if some of us have been able have seen a tea garden of this sizes. These are like 700 800 acres of land, and about 1,000 plus households live within the tea estates. And they are stay at different distances, because the tea garden has to be the workers have to work in the different parts of the tea garden, and there are pockets that have been created. So what the lines that you see, so there is a site in which the two sides, there are two cities on the on the top of the sheet, where that's the road, and there are uh, let's say the smaller lanes or sub lanes that are getting in the tea estate. And from the road, the last point of this particular tea estate was about 9 kilometers. And if you see, look at these workers trying to access the markets, they have little access to the market. And for every little thing, they have to depend, or so weekly they would go to a particular point where that weekly market comes up. And then they would have to depend on the small kiosks in the neighborhood for their other food items. So when we mapped this kind of access points, what we realized is these households were consuming very basic food. There was hardly any protein. There was very little animal protein. And similarly, there were other food products that what they consumed and what they couldn't, what they wanted to consume, what they couldn't, what they have access to, what they don't have. So how frequently do they go to which markets? So all those kind of questions were uh, asked, and as they express themselves in terms of their own daily kind of behavior, we were able to also build up something like this. Is of course a time clock for another study on telecom, but a similar kind of time clock was done for the tea garden workers to see what is the time they have to go to their home, have their food or cook their food, how much time they have and how much food they can cook, and what they want to cook. And all those things led to getting some kind of answers to the kind of quality of uh, food that they can cook and serve their children, and they themselves have. So they start at 7 in the morning in the tea estate. They get a break of about an hour, 1.5 hours in the at around 12 to 1, and then they again come back to work till 4:30. So if you look at their time clock for the females, entire day they hardly have time, and when they come back home, they are too tired to really cook too many things for the evening as well. So if you're looking at this whole pattern of their cooking and having food, we were able to see what kind of opportunities we have to introduce different kind of food products. So uh, now that we have talked about the community and all, we also need to look at the individual behavior. So what we have seen with these communities are that if you because they are not taking decisions individually in most of the buying decisions, they are dependent on one or two or three or more people. And when we want to conduct a study, typically in a research process, we are supposed to talk to the person who is the potential consumer or who is the consumer. But typically when we try that, he or she would invite another uh, friend or a colleague or a peer to stand with him, or and as we ask the questions, help him in answering those questions. So what it means is that trying to do a single trying to interview one person becomes a big difficulty against, and it is against the research protocol. But here, if you really want to understand things, we have to talk to more than one person to get the responses. So what kind of insights that we have we derive from such interactions? So in the nutrition supply chain, which I was talking about, so in the tea states, uh, this is some two outlets that we have created there and now. So when we were ideating, so the first thing was we wanted to understand the consumer, and we had to, while doing these maps, we were trying to look into what kind of affordable nutrition products these people can afford. Uh, what kind of markets are they accessing, their buying behavior, the purchase quantities, the frequency of purchase, etc. To be able to understand that what is the kind of business of the supply chain that we should be looking at, and it should not be a high scale or uh, such a scale that we will not be able to sustain. So it is important that we understand the per household consumption of different kinds of food, the kind of money spent on them. And therefore when we looked into those, what came out as an outcome was the kind of food that they do not have but they want to have, the kind of markets they access, and how it is timed, and if they have to go to the shop, how do they go to the shop, and in what do they buy, cash, credit, in what format, and of course the details with it. And from there came out the critical component about what products should we pitch as nutritional products to these people, to these potential consumers, and therefore what are the products that the point of sale should have. So that's the product basket. But again, from the point of sale, what is the point of sale? So what we found is the residential lines, they have shops, and so between strategically looking at the ease of access of these women, the weekly markets were more accessed by the males and relatively less by the females. And women workers, they have money in hand, but if they are not coming to the weekly markets, that means they cannot buy products which of their choices. So can we therefore, so therefore our whole strategy was to therefore target these line shops and ensure that they get access to the right kind of products, and we are able to provide the nutritional products that we intend to provide. So that kind of insights we were able to derive. And so that was one, and this is another thing that happened through such similar kind of observations when we were doing work for a foundation who wanted to impact the indoor air pollution. And we were looking at a product which was marketable, which is good, which is durable, which has aspirational value, and technologically much superior. So in that context, when we were doing the study, we sat with women, we watched them cooking, we watched them the quantity of food that they cooked, we watched them for food that is they cook in, as in India, we call it vegetarian food, and something that is like meat or other fish kind of food, which is, so they don't use the same stove for both kind of cooking. So there are a lot of complexities even within the kitchen from the point of culture, because it is a place where, according to the Indian culture, God stays. So that means people get food basically, but then it is an important place, and it has to be so the place, the sacredness of the place has to be maintained, and therefore important components for the design, even in terms of the wood. So what is the size of wood they have access to, how they put it there, if there's the new stove, what is the size of the space for fuel, what kind of size for the pots, rounded pots, flattened pots, what kind of pots. And all of that led to the design of, these were the early product designs. There are new product design that has come up, which is being marketed now, which are much better, technologically much superior. But basically the purpose of the project of reducing smoke emission by simple products but effective products happened, and we were able to, so EnviroFit is the organization which was created by Shell Foundation, and they have already marketed more than 10 million stoves across, not only in India but even neighboring countries, and to some extent Africa also. So so that's the story. And I think from a researcher's perspective, uh, basically it is like the researcher has to develop a mindset to understand the BOP. He cannot be an urbanite trying to research a person from that that community or that situation, the geographical area or the cultural context, and should be able to communicate well, and more importantly listen actively, because when they speak, they overcome lot of their own inhibitions to speak. So if we don't listen, then they switch off, and once they switch off, then we don't get what we want. So therefore the whole ability to be patient, and we have to use a lot of our own memory space to keep those things in mind, and ensure that we triangulate our own learning with them, so that we are sure that whatever we have understood are true and useful. So thank you so much. I think I've taken much more than what I was allocated for.
Thank you very much, Saroj, for this informative and insightful presentation. As a kind of punishment for exceeding your time, I would like to take your permission for exceeding the session for another 10 minutes or so, in case we have questions that we need to cater for, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, please. I'll be very thankful for that.
All right. Maybe
opportunity.
All right. Maybe till we receive our first question from our participants. I have actually a question, if you
Sure.
allow me. From all the examples that you shared, it shows that when it comes to ethnographic research, it's very much dependent on skillful researchers and the cooperation and the honesty of the subject. So what do you do in order to make sure that those two factors are fulfilled?
Yes, it is. So that's what I was just mentioning about, from the point of, as researchers, we have to be empathetic about that, those respondents, from the point that because they have less exposure, because they have they are not accustomed to this kind of a research process, they are hesitant to come forward. And therefore, when we are empathetic, we are helping them to express themselves, and these processes of participatory research helps them to express it themselves in their own way. And that's when they're expressing themselves in their own way, should have that patience to listen to them, and listen with genuine interest, and absorb what they are talking about. And many times what they speak, when they speak, they may not, from their context, it is an important component of their life, but maybe because of our own urban bias, we may reject that thought, and that is not advisable.
Right. Maybe another question related to the similarities between Egypt and India, because as we speak today, there are a lot of similarities in relation to the projects carried out either from the government or in partnership with the private sector in many areas for the BoP. Meaning we're talking about financial inclusion, microfinance, housing, subsidies, healthcare, and so on. When it comes to convincing the private sector with the value of this effective tool, it's a no-brainer because they have a business proposition that is more than motivating for them. But when it comes to the buy-in from the government, any tips to create this kind of buy-in from the government so that they can realize how important this tool is in designing the process, which is even more important than designing a product when it comes to setting policies and strategies for such vital services that they are offering to the BoP?
Okay, yeah. So yes, government typically takes up cases where there is a proof of concept, or where there is some kind of something that has been tested out and done on the ground. So what we are having now is different kind of projects where such. So I have been part of some of those such studies where the projects were then implemented on pilot scale, and all those strategies were tested out, and there was an outcome that came which came from as a result of all this pilot testing over a period of time, and that helped the government to take note that yes, something is working. So when something is working, then it is easier for government to take up, and there have been some projects where a organization, it's a social marketing organization, but they were usually involved in the contraceptive selling and other products, but they went into healthcare support systems where different kind of equipments were provided at the local level, and they were under the project building up those capacities based on research. So basically, what kind of local level things, let's say, for example, in a very last mile point, health point, you may not have even the basic things like a hemoglobin meter, or maybe a sugar testing kit, or even a BP, good quality BP machine, or some kind of a monitoring machines, or these days small ultrasound machines are also coming in. So initially when they started with very such small things, and it came out from the thing that when something goes wrong in the village, or those little far hinterland, coming to the city or town to get the services, they have a lot of hassles, there's a lot of expenditure, and often they suffer in that health from health in that kind of condition. So if something is available at the local health center with this kind of participative approach, then there are solutions that can be designed. So that happened, and over some time, the state government could see the benefit of having such kind of partnerships with the social organizations in the government system. So the kind of public-private partnership model was designed around to help deliver those services.
So now for questions from the floor by order. I have a question from Asma Kamel. The question is, are there guidelines on how to use tools like the market access map and time clock?
Yeah, so there is a process that we follow. So if we look at it from a researcher's point of view, there are some things like do's and don'ts in terms of engagement, but it is a skill that to engage and help them participate. So usually you have a list of some questions which are framed to be discussed, but they are all open-ended. They are all they are structured, but left to the community. Community decides how to discuss on those subjects. So you kind of, it's like a moderation of a discussion where you are not asking them questions, but you are putting subjects for their discussion, and they are supposed to respond to those issues. So for example, in one of the projects that we did with Panasonic, we were looking at drinking water, and when we were asking them, so if you ask them about where they go and get the water, whether they like the water or not, etc., probably most of the questions being answered is, oh, that's okay, we get water and there is no problem. But when we leave that thought to them in terms of water and their life and how much time they spend with water and their own issues with that water, and suddenly you discover a lot of things about the same water, which otherwise, if I would have had a structured question, they would not have probably answered it in that way. So that gives me that, or the researchers, when we do that, we find those kind of information very useful for our solutions, because they determine whether our thought process will work with them or not.
Right.
So many solutions get rejected if they are not seen from their light. So the user interface and user experience ideas are definitely there, but when even before getting into that stage, there are some things which are do's and don'ts, and they come out very clearly when we have this kind of maps.
Right. I have another interesting question from Rajib Mohanty. What are the best practices from the experience of Tea Garden, which can be replicated to other contexts in similar research?
So the Tea Garden project is more related to workforce nutrition. So in India, we have a lot of issues with adult nutrition, and when it comes to workforce, there's a lot of time loss because of poor health or uh, less efficiency in the workers, and all of it is related to the nutrition level of the people. So in that context, when we were building this whole story in terms of how to intervene, how to get the right kind of products, how to channel them into this tea gardens, we are trying to get a holistic solution that continues to survive and continues to flourish, even when this particular project is withdrawn as a project. And also, the good part that we are trying to build into the system is, if there are new nutrition products also, which are which may be complex nutrition products, they can also be channeled through the same supply chain. So that is where its sustainability, its replicability is being worked on. Uh, it has its own challenges because tea gardens have these are private properties, and there are certain issues in terms of access um, uh, which has to be factored. But yes, the tea gardens also are happy that such initiatives are being ideated, because ultimately it affects their productivity and their growth. From the government perspective, they are happy because tea garden workers have it affects the state's indicator. So if a large population is having issues with malnutrition, so then you through certain such initiatives, you are able to instead of giving away freebies and subsidies, here is a situation where with little intervention, such products are getting into the market. And it is not about, there is a level of affordability which exists, but the larger problems are more about accessibility and awareness about nutrition, which is affecting the community. So if the disease the disease prevalence drops, then it is about a healthy tea community that exists. And the scalability is that it can work across any tea garden where or with similar settings, or where we see that access is a challenge.
Right. And we have a gender-related question from Amir Ibrahim. It's about, has there been a shift in gender dynamics with women making more of the purchase decisions in rural India? What impact does this have on how we approach ethnography? The photos and the video had a lot of men, smiling face.
Okay. Yes. So, like I mentioned, women in India also. So we had situation where probably around 20 years back, uh, across the country, we had women behind the curtain, kind of, and with these kind of programs, women have come forward, started engaging, and the southern part of India definitely has a much has the empowerment has been much better, faster, and they are leading the microfinance movement in India. And of course, the northern part is slowly catching up now. So we have, and that is where the engagement level happens. That when we find that it's not that the women are not interested to come forward and discuss their own good, but it is basically the culture that has restrained them from doing so for quite some time. So when this engagement process comes, it has to be with that sensitivity. While women engaging with women is something which definitely um, is something one can easily look at acceptance. But from our experience, what we've seen that when we genuinely discuss issues, and when these women come forward and they see that we are working for their or we are researching for their good, they are more forthcoming and sharing a lot of their own challenges and issues. And we are therefore uh, we find that once we have been able to break the ice, then the information flows. So how we break the ice is where the researcher has to spend time on. We cannot jump into questions immediately. We spend a lot of time warming up on different contexts. Like typically in India, women would be very happy talking about their children and their wellness. So if we are starting to discuss something, health of children is a good topic to break the ice. And since when we talk about such issues, of course, we cannot talk from no knowledge. We have to have that knowledge to be able to carry a discussion and help them, or let's say we are able to engage in a way by which they feel that yes, we are. They can share information with us, which will be useful for them at a later date. So those kind of engagement processes are important, and therefore the skilling of researchers is important from this context. Because carrying a discussion is important. Many times I've seen that researchers ask questions because it is there in the questionnaire. They do not connect with the questionnaire. They do not. So they would have asked a question, and for which these women would have answered in a so if the question answer to the question is X, the woman would have said X plus 10, and still the researcher would have heard that all, but still would ask the question on the questionnaire because it is there the questionnaire. And these things are questionnaire or even in the discussion guides. So what happens is the connect or the flow of the discussion or the quality of discussion goes down if the researcher is not observant about his own the responses given and his response back to those questions.
Right. I would like to thank Mu'taz Darwish for his question about ethics. Any specific ethics protocols, learnings to comment on with this method?
So, okay, so from uh, from a point of ethics, see, as a researcher, of course, you are not supposed to be sharing personal information or things like that with anybody else. Like I mentioned about this ice breaking with women from the context of discussing with their about their children or their health or whatever. So in that when we are using that kind of processes, we have seen that sometimes respondents, whether women or men, they, because of their different experiences of life, they might have had bad times, and once somebody is hearing them with patience and empathy, sometimes they break down, and they break down bad. So these are like weaker stages, dimensions of their life, and therefore it is important that as researchers we are ensuring that we are not getting into any kind of um, engagement which from ethical point of view we do not share that information with anybody else, or with even with our own um, with our own organization. We keep it to that stage of things. And yes, from a research protocol point of view, like the things which I mentioned about, that you talk to one respondent because you're supposed to be talking to a particular socioeconomic set of people. But when we find that more than one has come, should we drop the interaction and have it only with one person? So that's what, as a methodology, we have found that the dyad and triad methods are important to ensure that we get the information, and that process has to be recognized by the organization and the client and whoever, because that's how you really get answers.
Okay. A question about India in particular from Vonani Nichandama. Thanks for the good presentation. My question will be, to what extent have you seen conversations, unstructured interviews helpful in India?
Yes. So the purpose is clear to the researcher. We have got the discussion guides where we know that these are the things we need the answers to. As a discussion, when we are moderating, we understand that most discussions would drift to areas which probably are not our interest areas, or it may move on to another area. It is important, therefore, as moderator of the session with the group or individual, to keep bringing them back at not abruptly, but with appropriate um, uh, injunctions to the topic that we are discussing. So yes, it is unstructured doesn't mean that it is a complete free for all types of thing. We are know what kind of information we want to have, and therefore as a moderator we need to control that much.
All right. Maybe the last question, that's from me. Actually, a statement from one of your slides. It's a knowledge organization that ideates, conceptualizes, activates new business solutions through a process of community co-creation. My question is, when you say community co-creation, so who are the participants in this community creation?
Okay, so the stakeholders that we want to build. So for example, if currently this tea garden case, if I take it because that's what I've discussed a little more in this particular session. So here the women are important stakeholders, and we know that the men are also stakeholders, but they are not the decision makers from the context of food, and because women are the core of that food system at home. But from the point of accessing food, the men are. So as a when we are discussing with that community, we figured that out, that who is doing what role. And also from that context, how is the retailer of that place, the line shop, what is his role in terms of the making products available to the people? Are they helping them to get special food if required? What kind of engagement levels they have? So when I'm saying that it is a process of co-creation, it means that something which they think is important, and each stakeholder has mentioned what is important. Now to weave through all of the stakeholders so that we are able to get a solution which probably there's a win-win for everybody. So there is a tea estate management who has a win side of it, the retailer has a win side to it, the women has a win side to it, and also even that small child. So what we observed, for I'm just taking another minute to explain this. So when we observed there, we found that while the mother and father have gone to the estate to pluck the leaves, it is the sister and brother who are taking care of each other, and they would have maybe a 5 rupee or a 10 rupee kind of thing to buy a small pack of biscuit or something. And when we were looking at that aspect of it, we realized that what they are consuming is only sugar and wheat flour. And therefore, what would be an alternate to a 5 rupee solution there? And therefore, that child became an important stakeholder. So when we were sitting and discussing with him, the child, we are also observing, so what if we give what kind of food the child is willing to take? So we discovered that a banana is a kind of nice thing which the child likes to eat, and the child, after having had that food, goes out to play, and it doesn't come back to the mother to disturb her while we are discussing. So that kind of observations helped us to think about the idea that if we introduce a banana for 5 rupees or less, whatever that price would be, we are able to substitute a biscuit which is less nutrient. So those kind of observations and experimentation while we are engaging with these different stakeholders helped us to design or bring out some solutions which were critical and which brought about some of those. So we are still working on that project to see what else we can do about it. We need to increase the basket. We need to increase the kind of products that have to be introduced. We need to educate people about millets and other things which are considered important nutritional value. So in a mix of all, I mean, the stakeholders solutions, it's not like something which is ready there. We have to observe, we have to try, we have to convert, and it happens as we become observant of each possible stakeholder.
Well, thank you very much, Saroj, for the insightful presentation. And I really hope that next time we are able to invite you in person in Egypt, not just through Zoom, after those difficult times over, inshallah. And I would like to thank also all the participants for their very valuable comments and questions that enriched our discussion. And I think now it's time to bring back the floor to Dr. Ali Aoun.
Thank you, Dr. Kass. It's quite a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine.
I want to thank Saroj. I want to thank Dr. Amr really for a very nice mind opener, very insightful discussion. Saroj, I do remember fondly our discussions in Delhi, and yes. This is actually what I learned, that when you design solutions, it has to be from the BoP, not just for the BoP. Yes. And I think that's sort of the mindset of co-creation that you and Amr were engaged in the very end.
Yes.
I really thank you. I mean, it's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Now,
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali.
I thank you all for staying with us beyond the 8 o'clock. I hope it was worth your time. And I invite you to join us on Wednesday. We're going to have another bottom-up. The title is going to be a bottom-up approach to subsistence marketplaces and marketplace literacy in a post-COVID world. And we're going to have Professor Madhu Vishwanathan, who's a professor of marketing at the College of Business Administration, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He's also a professor emeritus from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in more future events. Thank you, Saroj. Thank you, Amr, again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Take care now. Bye-bye all.
Bye.